Siamo sia equals quatslama shrohuam telsui. Alalia telsui, dus de elas papkalas telsui, dus alalachwat de quachwalitha. Ejka chwanelmach de solstemuch. Greetings, everyone. I just did my formal greeting in Halkomelem language, as did Cheryl prior to me. And I thank the people of the Coast Salish Nation for being here today. You know, when you come to a gathering like this, a lot of times you don't really know what it is that people are really wanting to hear, what they want to say. So I'm going to share a little bit of my experience. Can I just hit this? Good. Perspectives from both sides of the fence. From a heritage rights and heritage resources advisor to a consulting scientist with EBA engineering. That's some pictures of when I was working at Chehalis just recently. I grew up in Upper Nicola on the Nicola Lake Stock Ranch. I didn't know Indians were Indians until about grade 8. Everybody that was on the ranch was Aboriginal. And we didn't learn anything about it in school at all. Believe it or not, it was when I picked up a hitchhiker on the way to Vancouver and found out that Aboriginal people actually had a history going back 3,500 years where I grew up. I decided at that point in time I was going to be an archaeologist. And I registered at university at that point in time. From, I even hate to say how long I did it, but from 1969 until 1981, I was a government archaeologist, the last field archaeologist with the BC government. And in those days, we did Aboriginal consultation, although we didn't call it that. It was listening to people and these sorts of things. And subsequently, in 1981, I was asked by the Stalo Nation, when Cheryl was there, not long after your naming ceremony, to work for the Stalo, well, we say Huelmoch, Interchlapmoch, and Sequepmoch, the Shushwa, all of the tribes and bands down the North Thompson River, right down into Vancouver, regarding the CNR Twin Tracking Project. And during that period, I was working for 38 different bands. And the interesting thing was, I was working on the Aboriginal side, but my professor at Simon Fraser was working for the railway company. It got a little awkward, especially when I was no longer allowed to talk with him at university. And as it was, it did work out okay at the end of the day. From there, I worked 14 years with the Stalo Nation and 9 years with the Chehalis, or Chehalis Indian Band. Doing a little bit of archaeology here with some kids at Chehalis, teaching them hands-on about some of their culture. Nowadays, mostly what I do is dig holes related to other things other than archaeology with different band members. Key to my experience, and you know, I'm one of those too, if you got a question, you can throw it out in the middle of, as I'm going along, because I kind of prefer doing it that way. Understanding Aboriginal communities is important, especially cultural sensitivities. And one example of that, when BC Hydro was planning on doing the ILM project recently, they asked me, when I was in title and rights at Chehalis, they said, are there any serious issues with this? And I said, yes. You can't do any tower construction in October. Why not? I said, well, people are spiritual bathing in the area that you want to put the towers in. And this is something that we could not have outside people involved with this, because there are very, very sensitive things, especially with those who are initiates into what we call the smitla, the winter dance ceremonial. Cultural diversity as well. We have over 30 different languages that are spoken in British Columbia. 209, 220 First Nations are here, 620 across Canada. Every single one of those is different, and they look at themselves as different from one another. Some examples, kind of where I grew up, working with Stan Green at Chehalis and the Mission Indian Friendship Center. But it's gatherings like this one here. This was in a public park. people did not realize what was taking place here. What this was recognizing the fact that this public park was actually an Aboriginal place. And there was a naming ceremony here, and the purpose of this naming ceremony was actually to give people the names of that place so that they identified with it. Key that I wanted to, if I have nothing else to say today, this is it. First Nations are governments. And managing all of those different portfolios of provincial and federal governments with a limited staff and limited council and resources. I've been in First Nations where we have 8 members. 8. Now you're trying to do everything from intergovernmental relations, I said, and go through this list. Health services, housing, education, lands, water, fisheries, forestry, Aboriginal title and rights, all the legal stuff. Human resources, natural resources, administration, infrastructure, public works, capital works, tourism, economic development, IT, communications, and everything else, from sports to death. On top of that, we're dealing with all of those issues that happen in Native communities on an ongoing basis. I was talking with somebody in our company in one of our other offices, and he said, I'm not dealing with First Nations anymore. And I said, why not? He said, the last 2 times I went out, the office was closed after the meeting was there. So I phoned up and I found out why. People had died. The office was closed. We lost $1 million. So this is government, and this is, we were taking care of all of those things at Chehalis, and they have, believe it or not, we say 220 people working at the band office. But when you look at all of those different areas that they have to deal with, you can start getting a perspective on development and consultants that are coming in from the outside. They want to put in a mine. Who's going to deal with it? They want to put in a run-of-river project. Who's going to deal with it? Okay, that comes under other duties, right? One of the key impacts of legal successes, particularly with Dalgamouth, Haida, and Taku, has been the issue of what we call referrals. How many understand what referrals are? Okay, a few don't. With those court decisions, it became a legal duty for the governments of Canada and British Columbia in particular to inform Aboriginal peoples of any developments that were taking place in their traditional territory. Some First Nations have a fairly large territory. The Splatseen, for example, located out of Enderby. Their territory extends from the Big Bend in the Columbia River down to the border, and from the Rocky Mountains across to the Purcells and a bit further over, including 21 cities. Every single development that occurs in that area, they receive a notice from the government. I did a workshop up there with them in terms of trying to deal with it. I said, you can't handle all of this with a staff of 2. Okay, and they were getting, like 5,000 referrals a year on this. So, the issue of referrals is how do you deal with this? I had one from BC Hydro on the ILM project, 27,000 pages when I was at Chehalis, one referral. And, here's my buddy, James. We started handling things in a way, and I was brought on, among other things, for one reason. They said, look, you got to make referrals pay for themselves. And so we did eventually make them work and all of that. But it is a big, big, big issue with every single First Nation I've ever met. How do we deal with it? There's a stack in the corner of papers over here, some of which is worth $1 million. This one is worth $5 million, and they can't deal with it. There's nobody to do that work. The impact of the political successes at the same time has been having a phenomenal effect in Aboriginal society, resulting in the negotiation of impact benefit agreements with proponents. Yes, I did those. Meaningful engagement and input into environmental assessment process. I was responsible for that. First Nations revenue sharing. That's happening more and more on an ongoing basis. And when Jerry talks a little later on, you won't believe how fantastic some of these relationships are with the tall town. I'm not going to steal any of his fire. But with the Forest Kerr project, and there's Volcano project and other projects that are up in the tall town area. Elk Valley in the Tanakh area, Williams Lake Indian Band and Chatsel First Nation with Mount Polly. You know, if you want to check that out, I put the link there. BC Revenue Sharing, First Nations. There's pages of it, and there's phenomenal information that is there to look at. Forest Consultation Revenue Sharing Agreements. They went from FRAs to FROs, now they're FCRSAs, okay? Everybody in the Aboriginal community understands what those are. Then there's the development and recognition of land management plans. A lot of these have happened because of the treaty process. Land transfer agreements. I did one of those, okay? And it was a government action regulation order where 25 square miles of land was turned over to the Aboriginal people for exclusive use for the winter dance ceremonial. A place to put away their gear, finally, where they don't have to worry about it being cut down anymore. Somebody from the forestry department coming into the forestry office with somebody's sacred pole that they wrap around a sapling that's supposed to become one, a life pole, over time. Saying, hey, what's this? And they're wondering why the guy's sick in the community because his spirit has been upset. Cooperation agreements, land and resource management agreements. All of this with, and this is one of those that was reflected, Chief Stephen Point, and this is the recognition of the 25 square miles that happened. And then we have the issue of treaty versus non-treaty First Nations. There's a lot of fighting between the different groups that are there. What people don't realize is 53 of 209 First Nations in British Columbia are not involved in the treaty process. Guess who's getting all the money? Those that are in the treaty process are being funded. And yes, the idea behind it is they will get funds to negotiate treaty with government, and there will be a financial and settlement agreement afterwards where they get lands and so on and so forth. But those that are not involved in the treaty process are getting nothing. So we have a big difference in capacity just between those two groups. Those that are being funded, a lot of them have gone out and hired consultants like myself to work for them to help move things forward. And you have things like this. Contaminated sites. Well, you can't settle an agreement with First Nations if you have a contaminated site. You can't turn over contaminated lands to them if they're going to move into self-government. So INAC, or ANSI, as some are now referring to it, are funding the cleanup of contaminated sites on reserves and First Nations that are actually going to go through the treaty process. But don't even bother asking if you don't have a treaty in hand. Human resource limitations. We have these in terms of people's education and their expertise and capacity generally in a First Nation community. It's really, really hard a lot of times. Outside consultants, lawyers, everyone wears many hats, especially the chief. These were the roles that I had when I was in title and rights at Chehalis. And I don't want to go through them all, but these are a few of them, and make everything pay for itself. And enough so that we can hire some extra staff. First Nation, capacity, capacity, capacity. To engage with consultants, to engage with government, and to engage with proponents. And that is a really, really big issue with everything from forestry to mining companies. It's complex, really, really complex, and it's very, very demanding. And we wonder why suicide rates and everything are so high on Indian reserves a lot of times. I worked for more years than I like to think, right, since 1981 until 3 years ago, and I started work for an engineering company. And some people say, why? Why'd you go? And I said, I need to make some money. You know, you live in the community, you believe in it, and so on and so forth, but at a time when you don't have any pension anymore, and you know you're getting closer and closer and closer to retirement age, and you got nothing. You know, and so many times it was, we can't pay you this week. Why? Well, the money didn't come through from INAC, so nobody's getting paid. And, you know, you fight the cause, And those things happen, and you start saying, how the hell am I going to pay my mortgage, right? You know, everybody in the community is dealing with this. So the poverty is incessant, but you just learn to live with it. And so I started working for this company. I went for an interview on a Friday. I put my application in on a Friday, was interviewed on a Tuesday, and started the next Friday. It's a big company, and you know, the interesting thing is I moved from one area of kind of just getting comfortable with all that stuff into one where, what am I doing here, right? I had to learn about mining, energy, infrastructure, transportation, environment, water, and a whole bunch of other things. We've got 14 offices in Canada, and no sooner had I got going with this company, 6 months, we were bought by another company, Big Fish, okay? We thought we were a fish, we bought some companies, but then we got bought by another company. They decided that they wanted to go international, so they came into Canada and they bought, oh, is this going by itself? Oh. Nope, gotta go backwards here. Page up. This one here, 14,000 scientists, 20 countries, 50 offices in Canada, 300 worldwide. We have partner companies now that were bought, Wardrop Engineering, BPR Engineering, BNG Engineering, Franson Engineering, Parkland Pipeline, and Tetra Tech Construction Canada. And I'm the only person in Aboriginal relations for 15,000 people. Kind of going back to working for First Nations again, right? Okay, there's capacity, and more capacity. However, there's a big learning curve that's taking place on both sides of the street, I'm realizing. Most engineers are so surprised that you have to talk with Aboriginal people. We just want to build the bridge. You know, we just want to put in the mine, okay? We can do all of that. And like Cheryl was saying earlier, the most complicated part of these projects is not the technical stuff that is there, it's the human relations component that is there. There's all sorts of things that are going on, but it's interesting with Delgamuukh, Haida, and Taku, it's created an industry of consultants. When I started this job, it was really funny. They said, okay, you need a title. And I said, I don't really need a title. And they said, you're going to be the Aboriginal Relations Specialist. And I said, well, can't we just say Aboriginal Relations? They said, no, we need to increase the profile of our company. So I said, okay, it's not going to work, right? So I went out to Chehalis and I said, I passed my card out. And James looked at me, he broke up laughing. He said, shit, he said, I'm going to get me a new card too. White man specialist. Okay? So, you know, we used to be called by a lot of different names, heritage consultant, heritage advisor, and so on and so forth. And when I started doing this back in '81, the chief said to me, well, I was working for 38 chiefs at that point in time, but primarily one was close by, and I said, what is heritage? And he said, everything. Everything that we do is our heritage. Without it, without any one part of it, it's not our heritage anymore. Consulting works in many ways, and you know, one of the interesting things about this whole thing with consultants, I mean, at one point in time, there was me and 2 other people that were the consultants in the province. We called ourselves heritage advisors. That was it. There's over 200 now, okay, that are doing the type of work that I do. A lot of them are hired directly by the companies themselves, and what it is, there's a lot of ex-government pats, okay, that have taken on the idea that I can do an awful lot of big things, okay, doing for First Nations by going and working out in the community. But after a while, a lot of them realize that it's tough. It's a tough world, the Aboriginal world. They don't get a lot of money for a lot of these things. They don't last very long. Next thing you know, they're working for the mining companies, or they're working for the energy company, and so on and so forth at the end of it.